Doretta Sobolewski is the Director of Research at the Frontier Culture Museum of Virginia. She serves on boards for the Virginia Association of Museums, the Blue Ridge Children's Museum, and most importantly, Rocktown History. We're very grateful that she serves as our chair of the Collections Committee. In addition, in her spare time, she recently started a PhD program in Strategic Leadership Studies at James Madison University to research leadership in museums. So we are in very good hands with Doretta. She and her family live here in Harrisonburg, and I'm really excited that they share the enthusiasm that we do for our local history.
Well, thank you so much, Penny, for that lovely introduction. It is wonderful to be here this evening. Can everyone hear me okay in the room? Perfect. I'm excited to be here. Took Penny 3 years to ask me to come speak here, and finally I made my way here in front of you, and I'm delighted to talk to you a little about the European migration and settlement in the Valley of Virginia during the 1700s. So it's a very complex, very fascinating topic. I'm going to give a broad overview. There are a lot of nuances that do not fit into a 40-minute talk, but you can always come visit us at the Frontier Culture Museum, where we have more opportunities to dive into details that we're not able to cover here today. But I've organized my talk into 7 sections. So we'll focus on the place. We got to define where we are, the Great Appalachian Valley. Then we'll talk about the definition of the word frontier, because that is a very complex, very complicated term. Then we explore a little, why did settlers move to the colonies? How did the land claiming process work? Why and how did European people move to the frontier? What did early frontier settlements look like? And then we'll talk briefly about some of the different cultures that were present here. And then we'll wrap it up for our Q&A session. But let's start with defining the place. So Appalachia is a 205,000 square mile area that follows the spine of the Appalachian Mountains, and it includes all of modern-day West Virginia and parts of 12 other states. And the Great Valley is really a chain of valley lowlands of the Appalachian Mountain system that extends all the way from Canada down to Alabama. And this is really a great map that shows the larger Appalachian region. It focuses on the Great Appalachian Valley and the smaller valleys within. So let's take a quick look at the valleys within Virginia and then travel from the north down to the south. So you see in the key here, number 8 is the Shenandoah Valley, where we are right now. The southern part of the Shenandoah Valley borders on the James River Valley, which starts right around the county line between Augusta and Rockbridge. The Roanoke Valley is right next here. It's followed by the New River Valley, and then also the Holston River Valley that touches part of Virginia around the Smith County, Abington, close to the North Carolina state line. So these valleys are all connected and part of the Great Appalachian Valley. What I find really fascinating is that these valleys all connect to different parts of the country through the rivers that define them. So the Shenandoah and the James River valleys, they're part of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. The Roanoke Valley is part of the Albemarle Sound watershed in North Carolina, and the New River Valley, part of the Ohio River watershed, and the Holston River is part of the Tennessee River watershed. And the Tennessee flows into the Ohio, and the Ohio, of course, flows into the Mississippi. So if we think of rivers as connectors, it's fantastic to think how many places the Valley of Virginia connects to. So the different valleys were also connected by extensive networks of trails that had been established by American Indian peoples. Sometimes these paths are referred to as the Great Indian War and Trading Path, or the Seneca Trail. And it's that extensive trail network of footpath in the Great Appalachian Valley, all the way from New York down to Alabama. And part, as Penny was suggesting earlier, part of this network became later the Great Wagon Road, once Europeans settlers moved to the west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And we'll talk a little more about the Great Wagon Road in a little bit. But when Europeans started to push into the Valley of Virginia in the early 1700s, there were probably no permanent indigenous settlements in the valley. I want to emphasize that statements like these should be taken with a grain of salt. It is possible that new archaeological finds will correct such an assumption. And this is what makes history so fascinating, right? That's how we keep learning about the past and adding to our knowledge. So absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But to explore more about the complexity of indigenous communities, I've included this famous map by John Smith from 1612. As many of you know, John Smith was an English soldier and a leader of the first Jamestown settlement in 1607. In 1608, John Smith and a delegation of others led at least 2 expeditions that explored the Chesapeake Bay area. And he drew the map of the Chesapeake Bay, the surrounding natural features. If you go to the Library of Congress, you Google it, you're able to look at this map and zoom in on some of these amazing details that are included on the map. And John Smith also included a lot of indigenous place names. Much of the information that is included on this map came from native peoples directly, such as the Massawomek or the Susquehannock Indians who Smith met on his expeditions. So Smith's map is an important colonial document for understanding the location and names of indigenous towns located across coastal Virginia and the broader region. Now, Smith did not get as far west as the valley, but because of his interactions with some of these indigenous guides and the knowledge that they shared with him, he was able to document far into the Piedmont. Here on top, you can see a reference to the Monacan Indians. So to dive a little deeper more into our area, I have a special treat for you. This is a custom map. You are the first members of the public who ever get to see it. It is a draft map that the Frontier Culture Museum has been working on with a map maker, and it's going to get featured in our new permanent exhibit, which will open to the public in 2027. But here on this map, you see some of the different indigenous tribes in Virginia and the larger region around 1500. And you can see in the key up here, so there are 3 different language groups, Algonquian, Siouan, and Iroquoian speakers. And all of these have different languages, different cultures, so it was already a very complex place before Europeans came to this area. Moving forward, you can't just stay in Virginia to really understand the complex diversity that existed in the colonies. So by the 1700s, many of the indigenous communities had been impacted by the violent forces of colonization and the effect of European disease and violence that was devastating, and significant numbers of indigenous people across the entire continent died. Now, their cultures and ways of life had changed by the introduction of European trade goods. And when Europeans started to move into the Valley of Virginia, indigenous people were certainly living in the neighboring regions, and native groups from inside and outside the region continued to travel through the Great Valley as they had done for centuries. So even if there were no permanent indigenous settlements here that we know of, there was certainly an indigenous presence in the region. Contrary to the beliefs that many Europeans had, they did not come to a wilderness or an untouched land. Instead, they already entered an environment that had been shaped by human presence, and American Indians had lived and cultivated and changed the American landscape for millennia by the time Europeans arrived. And early Europeans really benefited from the remnants that remained from this American Indian presence. So, for example, European settlers in the Great Valley often chose abandoned village sites for their homesteads, or they turned grassland that American Indians had cleared for better hunting practices. They cleared those and turned them into pastures. So let's pivot for a second and talk about the term frontier. As I mentioned earlier, it's a very complex, very difficult term to define. It meant different things to different people. So I like to go back to the original definition that 18th century people used to define the frontier. And in the 18th century, the term frontier denoted any national boundary. One English dictionary defined it as frontier, the border, confine, or boundary of a kingdom or province, which the enemies find in the front when they're about to enter the same. And another, frontier, the marshes, the limit, the utmost verge of any territory. And you might notice an accent. I was born and raised in Germany, so I found it particularly interesting to dive into a German dictionary from the 18th century and see that the term frontier was used in German as well. I, as a born German speaker, had never heard that term until I started studying American studies at university. So very interesting, the things that we learned. But even in German, the term can be translated to frontiers are the borders of a country. And so in the areas between France and the German states of the Holy Roman Empire in the 18th century, for example, that area in between these spaces could be considered a frontier. Now, in colonial Virginia, another term commonly used to refer to what we now call frontier areas was the backcountry. And by the mid-18th century, a large colonial backcountry had emerged in the Great Valley, extending from central Pennsylvania to the uplands of Georgia. Over time, the term frontier became strongly associated with the North American continent. George Washington, for example, and other founding fathers, they used the term. And scholars today view frontier areas not necessarily as dividers, but rather as mixing zones, where, and this is a direct quote, where different cultures, environments, experiences, economies, motifs, and perspectives come into contact. Thus, frontiers are not merely geographical boundaries, but can exist between groups within a given region or locale. So at the Frontier Culture Museum, we see the frontier both as a mixing zone from a cultural perspective as well as a geographical space on the edge of European settlement. And the frontier was a dynamic place, culturally and geographically. And we show how people, cultures, and ideas from West Africa, England, Ireland, Germany, and other parts of North America came together in these spaces. And when Native Americans, European, and African cultures met, those cultures responded to each other, sometimes consciously and sometimes unconsciously. So that's the general framework that we're talking about. So let's take a closer look at why Europeans moved to the frontier. In the early 18th century, two frontiers developed simultaneously in Virginia. One was in the Piedmont, east of the Blue Ridge Mountains, that was predominantly Anglo-Americans pushing westward from the Tidewater in search of new lands after the Tidewater areas became crowded with plantations and the soil was exhausted from tobacco. The other, and the one that we're concerned with this evening, is the frontier in the Great Valley, in the Valley of Virginia. In the 1730s, Governor William Gooch, may have heard of him before, he issued large land grants west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And the main goal was to solidify the British claims against France, who also had a foothold here in North America. And they were pushing down into the Ohio Valley, threatening some of these English settlements. So the English colonial government hoped to protect the Piedmont settlements from French and indigenous attacks by bringing settlers into the Valley of Virginia. They wanted to create a buffer zone between the plantations east of the Blue Ridge Mountains. This image shows some of the land grants that Governor Gooch issued. We have up here the Beverly patent, and down here is the Borden grant. There are two contiguous early land grants west of the Blue Ridge, and they were granted in the late 1730s. So when Governor Gooch issued them, they were both initially in Augusta County, but by 1778, the Borden grant would serve as the core of a new county, Rockbridge County. Now, Harrisonburg and Rockingham counties were not part of the Beverly Manor grant. It covered much of Stanton and today's Augusta County. The Beverly's patent is named after William Beverly. He is the original grantee, and he was a member of the Eastern Virginia elite, and the grant covered about 118,000 acres. Borden grant was named for Benjamin Borden, a land speculator from the colony of New Jersey. And his land grant was in excess of 92,000 acres. Like other grant holders, both men were required to divide and parcel out their land to individual settlers. So these land grants initiated a substantial migration to the Valley of Virginia. By 1735, there were about 160 families that had settled in the northern region. By the early 1740s, so maybe only 10 years later, there were nearly 10,000 people that had settled in the Shenandoah Valley. So predominantly immigrants and settlers who had lived in the Delaware Valley and southeastern Pennsylvania came to settle in the Great Valley starting in the 1730s. Pennsylvania had really been a favorite destination for many people from Europe to come to the colonies in the late 17th and early 18th century. So it was both a destination for immigration as well as a starting point for frontier migration. But why did they leave Pennsylvania? It's beautiful. So why come here? Maybe it's because the Shenandoah Valley is even more beautiful, but they didn't know that at the time. But it's really the same story that had pushed Europeans out of the Tidewater into the Piedmont. The European population increased due to natural growth and increased immigration. Land became scarce. So it became increasingly difficult for tenant farmers to accumulate enough wealth to purchase their own farm in Pennsylvania. The gap between the wealthy and the poor had widened, and by 1760, 1/3 of all men were landless. People at the lower end of the economic spectrum were competing with newly arriving immigrants. Both groups had the alternatives to work either in the city for wages, rent eastern land from wealthy landlords, or migrate to the western frontier lands in the hope of becoming landowners themselves. And colonial promoters portrayed frontier settlement as an easy opportunity to become independent landowners, but of course the reality was quite different for many people. So let's take a look at Augusta County, for example, which was created in 1738. In the first 25 years of Augusta County's history, for example, 2/3 of all taxable white male did not own land. Those who did not become automatically wealthy either. Land speculators demanded payments, and this kept many settlers in debt for years. Only half of the frontier families paid off the debt during the lifetime of the original settler. Initially, very early on, they were cut off from markets, they were isolated in wooded areas, there was poor infrastructure, so early frontier settlers were also vulnerable to environmental adversities and wildlife and the weather. And despite all of these challenges, settlers had more chances of success and financial independence on the frontier than in any of the other places they had left behind. The process of acquiring land and becoming a landowner on the frontier was fundamentally undemocratic. Originally, the crown held title to all land and distributed large tracts to wealthy land speculators like William Beverly. Now, these grant holders were then responsible to break up the large tract grants into smaller parcels and to bring settlers onto the grant area in order to expand Virginia settlements. High-ranking colonists held the key positions to manage these lands. The county surveyor was really important, the colonial secretary, the governor, and the council. There were also local officials land speculators, agents, and surveyors that had often ties to the tidewater elite who endorsed these actions and protected their own interests, quite frankly. So aspiring settlers had two options to secure a patent to a piece of land. The first course was local. And this course was taken by these people who settled here, who came to the valley themselves, settled here before anyone else had claimed a plot of land. They requested that a local county surveyor, here in this case, it was Thomas Lewis, son of John Lewis. He was a county surveyor at the time. And so settlers petitioned the local county surveyors to survey a land that they had chosen so they could petition the court for a patent. If no one else had laid a claim to this particular plot of land, the surveyor surveyed the tract and certified its size. Then the petitioner filed the surveyor's plat with the Colonial Secretary's office in Williamsburg, who then issued the plat. The second option started in Williamsburg. People petitioned the governor and council directly for a land grant in Augusta County. If the petition was granted, the council allocated a specific acreage in a general location to the petitioner, who then took his authorization to the county surveyor in Augusta County. The surveyor then surveyed and certified a tract of the grant acreage on unclaimed land to the patentee, who received his patent after returning the surveyor's plat to the Colonial Secretary's office in Williamsburg. How long do you think it took to travel to Williamsburg during those days? A long time. So for either option, aspiring landowners had to pay surveying administrative fees. Over time, the crown land grew scarcer and newly arriving frontier migrants struggled to find and identify unclaimed lands. Local officials had little incentive to assist these newcomers, and quickly a local elite emerged, which controlled and restricted access to land. Some of them emerged as land speculators who bought and sold tract of lands for profit. They acted in accordance to two of the colony's long-term goals. First, they fostered the expansion of Virginia settlements, and second, they maintained an existing social order based on economic and social hierarchies by creating a stronghold to the land. So even if newcomers could afford the price for the crown land, other factors prevented them from acquiring it. Most of the men in Augusta County never owned any land at all. Options for the landless migrants, once again, were either to rent a tract of land, try and buy land from a landowner, work as landless laborers, or return back to the east, or move on to newer frontiers that were opening up in other places. So it's really a perpetual continuation of the same story over and over again. Another treat, another map, again, still in draft stage, but as Europeans started to move into the valley, they followed some of the main trails of an existing travel network, which we talked about earlier, that had been established by indigenous people for centuries. You can see here, this is the Great Wagon Road, splitting into the Great Wilderness Road here. You see some of these early settlements that were emerging across Virginia and the region beyond. So, of course, this main road is the Great Wagon Road. 18th century settlers made road improvements and turned it into a primary road for the settlement of the Great Valley and beyond. As many of you know, today's Route 11 follows roughly the same path as the Great Wagon Road. So with a little bit of imagination, you can follow in the footsteps of these people who came down here in the 18th century. Just gotta erase the Walmarts and the McDonald's from your vision. And then you can turn off your air conditioning, get in your car, and then imagine that you were actually not traveling in a wagon. Most people walked alongside a wagon at about 2 miles an hour. I would like to dive into that experience a little more. So I've got a short excerpt from a travel diary from 1753. A group of Moravians traveled along the Great Wagon Road from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania to Wachovia, Salem in North Carolina. Now, I looked this up on Google Maps. On I-81 today, it takes about 8.5 hours to make that trip. In 1753, it took this group 40 days. They left on October 8th and arrived on November 17th. So this is a great primary resource to help a modern audience understand the challenge of 18th century travel on the Virginia frontier. And it's a very long quote. If anyone is watching, when I watch, I'm typically in the kitchen fixing dinner for my 4-year-old son. So I'm going to read this out. I know some people don't like it when the presenter reads what's on the screen, but I think in order to give everyone access to this, I'm going to read it out. So, at daybreak, we crossed the Roanoke, which was very low, but full of slippery stones, and in high water, it runs half a mile over the banks. We had much difficulty in getting our sick horses across. A quarter of a mile beyond, we came to Evans Mill, where our road turned to the left and became very narrow. A mile further, we came to a steep hill, and the road sloped badly. We soon stuck in a ditch and were in danger of breaking our axle. In another mile, a rather high hill rose before us, and we had to unload half our things and carry them up on our backs. And even then, we could hardly get the wagon up. The going down was also steep. We locked 2 wheels, hung a tree on behind, and all the brethren held back by it. And so we crossed this hill safely. Then we had 1.5 miles of good road and stopped for lunch by a creek. Imagine 1.5 miles of good road. Isn't that exciting? It looked much like rain, and there was a large hill before us. We asked a man that we met whether we could get across the hill today, and he said, yes, someone lives on the top, and we could spend the night there. We believed him and drove to the foot of the hill, crossing a large creek. Then we tried to climb the hill, but it was impossible, the hill being too steep. So we decided to unload and carry the things up the hill. I'm just exhausted thinking about that. But it should really give you a better understanding what the term road meant in the 18th century. So it's a very different understanding from how we understand a road today. I love travel diaries. They're a great source to learn about people on the early Virginia frontier. And I want to share one other example with you. We traveled 10 miles without finding water. It was late already, and we were compelled to travel 5 miles during the dark night. We had to climb 2 mountains, which compelled us to push the wagon along, or we could not have proceeded, for our horses were completely fagged out. 2 of the brethren had to go ahead to show us the road, and thus we arrived late at Thomas Harris's plantation. Here we bought feed for our horses and pitched our tent a short distance from the house. The people were very friendly. They lodged strangers very willingly. Now, the footnote to this passage from the editors said, this plantation was probably the site of the present town of Harrisonburg, Virginia, and Harris stands for Harrison. Thomas Harrison, son of Reuben, was the founder in 1778 of Harrisonburg. So I haven't had the time to verify this information, but I wonder if there's anyone in the audience who has additional knowledge on this, and I would love to hear from you during the Q&A to discuss this. But I thought that was a fantastic little paragraph to include in this presentation. For the last 10-15 minutes or so, I would like to explore what a typical early settlement plot actually looked like. A typical frontier farmstead in the valley consisted typically of a one-story log cabin house, perhaps small outbuildings, and a few acres of cleared land for cultivation, which was typically fenced in. Family farms ranged between 100 and 400 acres in size, but it seems that on average only 10 to 12 acres of the land were actually cleared during the early years of settlement. Properties often consisted of a large amount of woodland in which livestock roamed freely. A meadow and small orchards with apple and peach trees were also typically part of an early settlement. So after creating some shelter on their chosen plot, one of the first challenges that settlers faced was to change the wooded landscape into agricultural land. So for the first few years of settlement, settlers produced on a subsistence level before they had enough land cleared to produce enough resources and engage in surplus production and selling it to other markets. On early frontier settlements in the Shenandoah Valley, 90% of all farm products were used for subsistence, but by the mid-1760s, Valley farmers had on average 25% of their products available for export. In 18th century, settlers developed trade links with Eastern markets pretty quickly, and settlers produced for the international market within one generation of settlement. Farmers focused on growing cereal grains, particularly wheat and corn, and they also made hay for horses and cattle, which they kept for either draft power, leather, or meat. Turkey and chicken provided feathers and meat, and stock raising, cattle, swine, and turkey later became a key market enterprise when settlers started to produce for the market. Initially, wheat was mostly produced for local consumption, but by the middle of the 18th century, the global and continuous demand for wheat flour brought prosperity to the Valley of Virginia and connected it to the trade network really across the entire Atlantic world. As more Europeans moved to the frontier, homesteads were often adjacent to other settled properties, and they were connected by roads and other paths, and they were creating an agricultural neighborhood. This was typical for the early settlement landscape. Adjacent farms and plantations, often located along streams and waterways, they formed a linked rural neighborhood of 2 or 3 miles in extent. Over time, larger settlement patterns emerged as the influx of settlers increased. First came hamlets. These are smaller clustered units that were usually not far from these rural neighborhoods, and they provided some supporting functions such as artisan shops or stores, schools, churches, and mills. Sometimes local justices, ministers, and school teachers also lived there. Then over time, villages emerged as these hamlets grew. They were much larger clusters units, which likely included more stores, more church, meeting houses, a tavern, and after 1798, also a post office. The biggest unit of settlement at the regional level were towns, which developed in urban-like hubs of commerce. In order to qualify as a town, settlements had to have at least 20 to 25 families or 100 to 120 people. They had to live in close proximity to each other. And in an 18th century context, a town implies that it had a legal status of a settlement, and it entailed self-government by a group of local trustees, and it had the right to conduct annual fairs. So for communities that qualified as towns, urbanization, growing even bigger into cities, was not necessarily the next step. Subsequent population increases varied, and often they simply served as rural support and administrative hubs for the area. But these towns became the center of trade and administration and commerce, but predominantly they served as support functions for the rural economy. On the Virginia frontier, settlement patterns were often characterized by ethnic diversity. We heard about Moravian travelers traveling through. They also shared with us who they encountered. So and they refer to settlers of Irish, Swedish, German, Welsh, Scottish, and English descent on their journeys. So we often talk about Scots-Irish and German settlers in the area. Those were certainly the largest ethnic groups here, largest cultural groups, clustering in different sections of the valleys, but there were also other groups represented here. And most people that these Moravians encountered lived on farmsteads scattered through the countryside, but they were often in close proximity to a main road. Again, seeking this connection to trade, connection to export opportunities. As I said, some areas were more dominated by Scots-Irish or Irish Protestants, others by Germans, but there were also some crossovers. And it's really a wonderful primary source, these Moravian diaries, to get a glimpse of what settlement along the Great Wagon Road looked like. And there were also some surprises that the Moravians covered. Reverend Gottlob went half a mile ahead to a free Negro who is the only smith in these parts to have his horse shoot. The Negro and his wife, who was a Scotch woman, were very friendly to Brother Gottlob and told him that they had often heard Brother Nyberg preach, and also the brethren in Philadelphia, and that they were now reading the Berliner Reden, which were published in German. They were glad to see brethren and happy to serve us. This African American is Edward Tarr, and his story is really fascinating. He is a formerly enslaved African American who purchased his freedom, then moved to the Virginia frontier with his white Scottish wife. Tarr is probably the first Black landowner west of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and he's a blacksmith, an artisan businessman. He's a founding member of the local Presbyterian church, and a well-respected member of the community, and he speaks German. So really talk about cultural connections and transformation. And anyone who's interested to learn more about Edward Tarr's history, I can recommend Turk McCleskey's book, Road to Black Nut Forge, and I believe Turk actually spoke here a couple of years ago, so yeah. But it's also important to stress that Edward Tarr's story does not tell the typical experience of African Americans on the Virginia frontier. A few of them went to the frontier on their own terms, like Edward Tarr, but most of them came here as enslaved laborers. By the antebellum period, slavery was well established in the valley. It is inherently difficult to give exact numbers of enslaved laborers, as far as I know, since the first federal census was only taken in 1790. Historians consult parish records that include lists of tithable individuals, those are taxable people, and look at other primary sources to gain better insight into the Black population. Augusta County, again, can be used as an example for the African American presence in the backcountry. We know that by 1769, several hundred enslaved people were held in bondage by the county's white population. Most of these enslaved people came from the slaveholding areas in eastern Virginia and the Piedmont. And while there were a few free Black people on the early frontier, they were the exception, just like in other regions of the British colonies. So only about 1% of enslaved Blacks living in the British colonies became free prior to the American Revolution. But in conclusion, I just hope that this was a broad introduction to you to the complexity of the settlement of the valley, and I hope that it shed some light on who was here, and particularly that this was very diverse groups of people. So we talk about indigenous tribes, European settlers, and enslaved Africans. None of these groups were homogeneous. They were all distinctions, there was all cultural diversity within these groups, and each person had their own experience as they came to the frontier, voluntarily or involuntarily. So like every single person had their own experience in this room. So along the same lines, I'm going to do one quick push for Rocktown's History's incredible programs that Penny was talking about earlier. I would strongly encourage you to sign up to the newsletter, become a member if you're not a member already. I see some volunteers here. Thank you so much for everything that you give to Rocktown. But Rocktown is going to unveil a very exciting new project later this year that talks more in depth about the migration to this area. So I encourage you, if you want to learn more about it, sign up for the newsletter, and then we'll keep you updated as this project comes to its final launch, right? So thank you so much for being here on this rainy evening, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Okay.
Oh, I see. Okay. Do you want me to ask it? It's too much feedback. Okay, somebody in the room had a question.
How would you differentiate between German and Swiss,
Great question.
considering that Germany was not a country?
Yes, that is a fantastic question. So again, you put your finger on one of these little, dare I say, sloppy things that I sometimes fall into when we talk about Germans. Often we talk about German-speaking people. The immigrants we're talking about, they were often from southwestern Virginia along the Rhine River. Many of them had actually Swiss ancestry. So late 17th century, there was the War of the Palatinate. So without going into too much detail, southwestern Germany was close to France. There were a lot of wars during the 17th century. There was a lot of suffering. Lots of people died. To repopulate some of these regions, the counts, the dukes of the Holy Roman Empire in that region brought immigrants from Swiss up into that area. So often there was already a migration history. So when we talk about Germans, you're absolutely right. They're Germans with a Swiss background. So typically we talk about German-speaking immigrants, and many of them were Swiss as well. So yes, you're right. It was the Holy Roman Empire. When we talk about Germans, we talk about the Germans coming from these German-speaking territories of the Holy Roman Empire. Does that answer your question?
Yes, apparently I had both Zimmerman and Wheelbarger ancestors that came directly from Halle, Switzerland,
Okay.
down the Rhine in 1744 and owned land in Rockingham by 1749.
Oh, wow. That's great history, yeah.
And the land later became the little community of Zenda.
Yeah, and in the early 18th century, the British crown, Queen Anne, for example, she had a little pamphlet that was sent to areas in these German-speaking regions to recruit settlers to the frontier. So that's perhaps how your ancestors came here. Yeah, yeah, thank you.
Okay, we're going to do an online question
Yes.
real quick. Was Alexander Spotswood aware that the valley near Swift Run Gap would be unoccupied by Native American farmers in villages when he launched his famous expedition?
That is a wonderful question. I do not know. I do not. I do not know if. Yeah, that's not my area of expertise. Thank you for the question, though.
Yes.
Yeah.
You spoke about the board and you spoke about the Borden and the Beverly land grants, and then from Shenandoah County North was Fairfax. What would Rockingham have been?
My understanding is it was not a land grant. After the county was established in 1738, settlers could come in and then go through the same process, except they were going directly to the courts and not through the agents of the grant holders. Yeah.
I had heard that our ancestors that went from Madison and came over to the valley got his land most likely because he worked on the quote-unquote chain gang that measured the road that came over Swiss, the mountains into Elkton. And I was just wondering if you'd heard anything about that.
No, I don't know anything about that, but if you do find out, please let us know. I would love to know more about that. Yeah. Yeah.
This will be an odd preface, but twice in my life I've tried to dig a stump. That was unpleasant. I don't recommend it. What kind of technology was there at the time? Fire and oxen, but how did you clear 10 acres of mature trees with you, a couple kids, and your uncle?
Yeah, slowly, with a lot of work. So often you could girdle a tree, that is cutting the bark off, and then the tree would slowly die, and then chop it down. But to get these stumps out, often they would use horsepower if they had it, or digging them out. But that's all I know as well. Some of my colleagues at the Frontier Culture Museum who work on some of these outside exhibits, they probably know more about that. So you just got to come visit us in Stanton.
Another question from the chat. What information has become available about health or medical practices? For example, were herbalists known, and did they serve beyond their immediate family? Is there anything in the Moravian diaries maybe about that?
Not that I have
Okay.
known. No, that's a great question.
Yeah. And then here's another one. I'm curious about the language diversity among the population at that time.
Mm-hmm.
What does the evidence say about how different language communities did or didn't mix?
Yeah, great question again. So initially, as far as my research has shown, which I use work from like Warren Hofstra, for example, who's done a lot of work on the Shenandoah Valley. So initially, different groups, let's just talk about Scots-Irish and Germans, they would settle in groups. Over time, there was intermarriage, people would mingle together. But we here in the Valley, we also had the Hinkle Press that published in German until I believe 1812. So some of these German communities were holding on to their German heritage for a while, as is still the case today. When I was still working at the Frontier Culture Museum, I would have a group of visitors from the community here, and they were Mennonite, members of the Mennonite church, and they told me that some of their church services were still conducted in High German, even though they were speaking English in their family life. So, yep.
Anybody else in the room?
So after the Civil War, you have this Frederick Jackson Turner idea of the frontier,
Yeah.
which I think has been really problematic.
Yep.
In the late 20th century. We kind of decided this was a bad idea, the way he was making the frontier into something ideological. How does the Frontier Culture Museum kind of work with that?
Great question, and that's one thing that we discuss in detail. So for everyone who doesn't know, Frederick Jackson Turner gave a speech in, I believe, 1893 in Chicago at a convention claiming that the frontier is closed. At this point, the US Census, and I believe the definition of a frontier was a population of less than 6 people per square mile. Please don't quote me on that, but it's something along these lines. So Frederick Jackson Turner's famous frontier thesis claims is based on these findings of the US Census. There's no more frontier. And he talks about this mythological creation of the American individual. And it's highly problematic because it doesn't take into account the impact of these different groups that were also present on the frontier. So it's a very Eurocentric, a very white-centric perspective. So we do not agree with his assessment that this was this formative experience. But I think there is something to be said about change over time. We just need to make sure that we take every perspective into account to give a more accurate depiction of this complex, complicated, and violent history that took place here. So thank you for that question. Yeah.
Let's have another round of applause. Thank you so much for coming and sharing.